The Eyes of the Republic. The Women Who Spied for Venice. Hello, you are back. Good. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Turn off whatever light is still on somewhere in the room. Let the dark settle around you the way water settles when you stop moving through it. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere that no longer exists. Not a country, exactly. Not a city in the way we usually mean that word. Something stranger and more specific than either of those things. A place built on water, held together by secrets, governed by silence, and defended, for nearly 1,000 years, by a system of intelligence so sophisticated that modern spy agencies still study it. Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene republic. At its height, in the 15th and 16th centuries, Venice was the most powerful trading state in the known world. Its ships carried goods between east and west. Its merchants negotiated with sultans and popes and emperors. Its navy controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Its treasury was the envy of every monarch in Europe. And underneath all of that visible power, underneath the marble facades and the gilded gondolas and the carnival masks and the music drifting across the water on summer evenings, there was another Venice entirely, an invisible Venice, a Venice of informers and coded letters and midnight arrests and whispered conversations in back rooms behind locked doors. A Venice where every foreign ambassador understood that his movements were being tracked, his servants potentially bribed, his correspondence possibly read. A Venice where the air itself seemed to carry the texture of observation. Information was what kept Venice alive. More valuable than silk, more valuable than spice, more valuable than the gold that passed through the Rialto in quantities that made other cities dizzy. And the people who gathered that information, the people who moved through the city and beyond it, listening and watching and remembering and reporting, were not all the obvious candidates, not all soldiers and diplomats and official agents. Some of them were women. This is the story, or as much of it as survived the centuries, the fires, the deliberate destructions, and the simple passage of time. Settle in. I will tell you everything slowly. To understand the women who spied for Venice, you first need to understand the city itself, not the postcard version, the real Venice, the Venice that existed before tourism turned it into a museum of itself. Venice was built by refugees. When the Roman Empire began its long collapse in the 5th century, the people of the northern Italian mainland found themselves in the path of one invasion after another. The Visigoths, the Huns, the Ostrogoths. Each wave of violence pushed more people toward the one place that offered natural protection, the lagoon. The lagoon was not, on the face of it, an obvious place to build a civilization. A shallow, brackish expanse of water, separated from the Adriatic by narrow strips of barrier islands, prone to flooding, difficult to navigate without local knowledge, producing nothing obvious in the way of agricultural resources. But it was defensible. You could not march an army across a lagoon. You could not besiege a city that sat on islands in shallow water unless you had boats. And the Venetians were very careful about ensuring that their enemies did not have sufficient boats or the knowledge to use them effectively. The refugees who came to the lagoon brought whatever they had managed to carry: skills, knowledge, capital, connections. They brought the experience of Roman administrative organization. They brought trading relationships with the Eastern Mediterranean. And they brought a particular attitude toward power, a deep and abiding suspicion of any single person accumulating too much of it. This suspicion shaped everything Venice became. The Venetian Republic in its mature form, was one of the most sophisticated governmental structures in the medieval world. It was an oligarchy, power held by noble families whose names were entered in the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book, but an oligarchy with elaborate internal checks. The electoral process for choosing the Doge combined appointment and lottery in ways so complex they read like a constitutional scholar's fever dream. Every step was designed to prevent any family from coordinating an outcome. Venice was, in other words, a state built by people who had thought very hard about the problem of power and had designed their institutions specifically to prevent any one person from ever having too much. This same instinct to watch, to verify, to gather information, to never simply trust, pervaded the entire culture of the Republic. Every Venetian noble who served as an ambassador abroad was required, upon returning, to deliver a formal written report to the Senate, a relazione, detailing everything he had observed about the country, court, ruler, economy, and military of the place where he had been stationed. These reports were read aloud in the Senate, discussed, preserved in the archives, and consulted by future ambassadors before they departed. Over centuries, Venice accumulated a library of geopolitical intelligence that had no equivalent anywhere in Europe. A new ambassador going to the court of the Ottoman Sultan could read reports stretching back decades, describing everything from the Sultan's personality and habits to the factional politics of his court, to the best routes between Constantinople and Venice. This was institutional memory as strategic advantage, but the formal diplomatic reports were only one layer of the system. Below them, alongside them, operating in a different register entirely, was the informal network, the agents who were not ambassadors, the informers who were not officials, the sources who could not be named in any official document but whose information was no less valuable for that. And it was in this informal layer that women became essential. Before we go further into the women, we need to understand the institution that most directly benefited from their work. The Council of Ten, Il Consiglio dei Dieci. Founded in 1310, ostensibly as a temporary emergency measure to deal with a specific conspiracy, the council became one of the most durable and powerful institutions in Venetian history. It outlasted its original emergency mandate by nearly 5 centuries. In theory, the Council of Ten was a committee of the Senate, subordinate to the broader governing bodies of the Republic. In practice, it operated with a degree of secrecy and autonomy that made it something closer to a state within a state. It had jurisdiction over matters of internal security, foreign intelligence, treason, and anything else that it determined touched on the survival of the Republic. It could arrest, try, and sentence without the normal processes of Venetian law. Its deliberations were not recorded in the public archives. Its sources were protected with absolute rigidity, even under duress. Agents were expected to reveal nothing. The council had a substantial intelligence budget, carefully managed and deliberately obscured in the Republic's accounts. Payments to informers appeared as miscellaneous expenses or were simply absent from records entirely. They also had a remarkably sophisticated understanding of how intelligence actually works. They understood that the most valuable information came not from official sources, but from the informal networks of human relationship that crisscrossed any society. That people talked, that even careful, guarded people had moments of openness. That the best agent was not the most heroic, but the most unremarkable. The person whose presence was so natural that no one thought twice about what they might be observing. And they understood, And this is where the women come in, that certain social roles gave access to conversations and moments that were simply not available to official male agents. The Council of Ten did not create a formal program for female intelligence gathering. That would have been too visible, too documentable, too vulnerable to exposure. Instead, they cultivated relationships. They identified women who had access to the right people and the right rooms. They established informal arrangements, carefully deniable on all sides, through which information flowed, and they paid. Not always in money, sometimes in protection, sometimes in influence, sometimes in the kind of quiet intervention that could make a legal problem disappear or a license get approved without the usual delays. The most effective arrangements were the ones where the woman had her own reasons to cooperate, where the exchange felt, if not entirely equal, at least mutually beneficial, where she was a participant who had made a calculation about her own interests, not merely a tool being used. This is a subtler picture than dramatic spy stories suggest. No secret codes exchanged in dark alleys, no elaborate disguises, just women in their ordinary lives, in the rooms they normally occupied, listening to conversations that normally happened around them, and occasionally passing what they heard to someone who found it useful. But quiet and ordinary as it worked. For centuries, it worked. If there is one category of women who were most systematically valuable to Venetian intelligence, it is the category known as the cortigiane oneste, the honest courtesans. The phrase requires unpacking because in 16th century Venice, it means something quite different from what the word courtesan has come to suggest. Venice in the 16th century had a population of approximately 100,000 people. Within that population, according to a census conducted in 1509, there were 11,454 women classified as prostitutes and courtesans, roughly one woman in nine. This extraordinary figure was the product of Venetian marriage customs. Noble families limited the number of sons who could marry in order to prevent the fragmentation of family wealth. A noble family might have 4 or 5 adult sons, of whom only 1 or 2 would be permitted to marry and produce legitimate heirs. The others were expected to remain unmarried and to direct their energies elsewhere. The existence of a large regulated population of courtesans provided exactly this outlet. The Republic actually managed and taxed the sex trade. Courtesans paid taxes, were subject to regulations, were assigned specific areas of the city. It was, in the characteristically Venetian way, a system. But within this system, there was an enormous range of status and circumstance. At the bottom were the meretrices, street prostitutes, vulnerable, poorly paid, with almost no social standing. At the top were the cortigiane oneste, a category defined not by what they sold, but by what they offered alongside it. A cortigiana onesta was educated. This was the fundamental distinction. She could read and write in Italian and often in Latin and sometimes in Greek. She knew music, not just as a listener, but as a performer, capable of singing and playing the lute with genuine skill. She knew literature, could discuss Petrarch and Dante and Boccaccio with intelligence and real engagement. She knew philosophy, history, geography, something of medicine and natural philosophy. She could converse with the cardinal about theology, and with a merchant about trade routes, and with an artist about the theory of proportion, and with a soldier about the politics of the eastern frontier. And she could do all of this while making the person she was talking to feel interesting and valued and genuinely understood. This last skill, making a powerful man feel that his intelligence was being recognized, was perhaps the most valuable of all. It was what brought the most important men in Venice and the most important visitors to Venice to her door. The courtisan honest maintained what were in effect private intellectual salons. Their houses were gathering places for artists and writers, and musicians and scholars and diplomats and merchants, and the occasional foreign dignitary. The quality of the conversation was genuinely high, not merely a performance of sophistication, but the real thing, because these women had invested enormously in developing the intellectual capacities that made the conversation possible. They were, in many respects, the only women in Venice who had access to serious intellectual life. Noble women were sequestered in their family palaces, their movements controlled, their access to the public world of ideas extremely limited. The courtisan honest occupied a social space that was technically marginal, outside the boundaries of respectable society, but that was, paradoxically, at the center of the city's intellectual and political life. Their marginality was, in a sense, what gave them their access. A cortigiana honesta could receive a visiting Ottoman diplomat, and a Venetian senator, and a Florentine banker, and a Spanish nobleman all in the same evening, and none of them would find it strange. The gathering was social rather than official. It was not the kind of meeting that appeared in diplomatic registers. It was the kind of meeting that happened all the time in Venice's private spaces, where the boundaries between personal entertainment and political conversation were perpetually blurred. And it was precisely in these blurred spaces that the most interesting things were said. Of all the names that survive from this world, the most fully documented is Veronica Franco. She was born in Venice around 1545, the daughter of a courtesan who understood the economics of her world clearly enough to invest in her daughter's education. Veronica learned to read. She learned to write with genuine skill. She studied music and learned the lute and to sing. She was tutored in literature and poetry and became, in time, not just a reader of verse, but a writer of it, a genuinely accomplished poet whose work was published and read and taken seriously. This cannot be overstated. In the 16th century, almost no women published poetry under their own names. The literary world was almost exclusively male. Veronica Franco entered it by navigating an extraordinarily narrow path between the respectability required to be taken seriously and the independence required to operate at all. Her published works include 2 volumes of terzarim, the verse form used by Dante, and a collection of letters. The poetry is technically accomplished and emotionally direct, dealing with love and desire and the particular complexities of a life lived outside conventional female roles. The letters reveal an intelligent, socially astute woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why. By her late 20s, Franco had established herself at the very top of her profession. She had a wealthy and influential patron, Domenico Venier, a prominent Venetian nobleman and literary figure who was genuinely devoted to her, both as a woman and as a poet. She had a house in a good neighborhood, servants, the visible markers of a successful and stable life. More importantly, she had access. Her house was a gathering place for some of the most important men in Venice and some of the most important visitors the city received. Tintoretto painted her portrait, a fact that speaks to her social standing as much as to anything else, since Tintoretto painted the faces of Venice. And then, in the summer of 1574, came the most significant encounter of her life. Henri de Valois, Henri III of France, as he would shortly become, passed through Venice on his way from Poland back to France to take the throne left vacant by the death of his brother. He was 22 years old, charming, intelligent, and deeply interesting to the Venetian government, which was always carefully managing its relationship with the major European powers. The Venetians organized elaborate entertainments for the visiting prince, regattas on the Grand Canal, a banquet in the Doge's palace, demonstrations of Venetian wealth designed to impress and dazzle. And in the middle of these official entertainments, Henry III of France found his way to Veronica Franco's house. We know this happened. We know he visited her. We know she later sent him a gift, a miniature portrait of herself, accompanied by a poem. We do not know exactly what was said between them during the visit, but we know what the Venetian government wanted from the encounter. They wanted intelligence about the new French king, his character, his intentions, his relationships with his advisors, his attitude toward Venice and toward the Ottoman Empire, and toward the Spanish, whose power in Italy was a constant concern. A formal diplomatic audience produced formal diplomatic conversation, carefully prepared statements and studied responses. The performance of statecraft that told you something about a court's official positions, but relatively little about the human being at the center of it. An informal visit to a courtesan produced something different. A young man relaxed, away from the protocol that governed every other moment of his Venetian visit. A young man who, if he talked at all, talked more freely than he would have done across a negotiating table. Did Veronica Franco report to the Council of Ten on what Henry III said? There is no document that says so directly. The Council of Ten did not leave that kind of paper trail. But several years after the Henry visit, Veronica Franco was brought before the Venetian Inquisition. The charges were witchcraft, a standard accusation used as a tool against inconvenient people. What happened next is remarkable. She was acquitted, completely and without significant consequence. In a period when the Inquisition's reach was formidable, Veronica Franco walked out of the proceedings essentially unharmed. The charges did not stick. The process was not prolonged into the kind of grinding ordeal that broke so many others. Someone protected her. Someone with sufficient influence to make the Inquisition's interest go away quietly and quickly. The most plausible candidate is the Council of Ten, or a figure closely connected to it. An agent who had been useful, who had provided valuable access to one of the most important foreign visitors Venice had received in years, was an asset worth protecting. This is inference rather than a proof. But the pattern of her life, the access, the prominent visitors, the Inquisition charges, the surprising acquittal, the continued social protection, is consistent with a woman operating within a system that valued her and had reasons to keep her safe. Part 5. The Education of an Asset Veronica. Franco was exceptional, but she was not unique. The world of the cortigiane oneste produced other women with similar combinations of accomplishment, access, and apparent connection to the intelligence apparatus of the Republic. What is worth understanding is how a woman came to occupy this position. The specific intellectual and interpersonal skills that made some women genuinely valuable as intelligence assets. The education typically began early. A girl born to a courtesan mother or to a family that recognized the economic possibilities of the profession would begin serious instruction in reading, writing, and music from a young age. The investment was substantial, but it was understood as investment in future earnings rather than expense. The formal educational content, the Latin, the poetry, the music theory, was only part of what made a quotidiana honesta effective. The other part was something less easily taught and more difficult to name. Call it social intelligence, the ability to read a room, to understand within minutes of meeting someone what they needed from the interaction, what kind of attention they were seeking, what topics would engage them and what would shut them down, what they were proud of and what they were insecure about, what they wanted to say and what they were holding back. This kind of intelligence is not the same as formal education. It is developed through practice and through a particular quality of attention, a habit of genuinely listening to people, genuinely observing them, genuinely trying to understand what is happening beneath the surface of their words and gestures. For women in the courtesan's position, this skill had obvious economic value. A woman who could reliably make powerful men feel interesting and understood could command higher fees, maintain longer relationships with wealthy patrons, build the kind of sustained social position that provided real security. But the same skill that made her economically successful also made her potentially valuable for something else. A woman who was genuinely paying attention to the powerful men who visited her, not just performing attention, but actually listening, actually noticing, would accumulate over time an extraordinary wealth of information. She would know which senators were in debt and to whom, which noble families were feuding and why, which foreign merchants were bringing money into Venice and which were taking it out, which visiting diplomats were conducting parallel back-channel conversations and with whom. She would know things that official channels could not easily access because the official channels were formal and bounded and operated by rules that determined who could say what to whom. She had no such rules, she just listened. Part 6. The Lion's Mouth, the Bocce di Leone. The Lion's Mouths were one of Venice's most distinctive institutions. Carved stone reliefs of lion heads with open mouths set into the walls of buildings throughout the city. They served as post boxes for anonymous denunciations. Any citizen could write a note accusing another of any crime or suspicious activity, fold it, and deposit it in the nearest lion's mouth. The Council of 10 would receive the note and decide whether to act on it. The system worked because Venice was a city where everyone watched everyone else and where information had social value, where knowing something useful and communicating it to the right people was understood as a form of civic participation rather than simply as betrayal. The Bocce di Leone are sometimes described as an instrument of terror, a tool of paranoia that encouraged neighbors to denounce neighbors out of fear or malice. This is not entirely wrong. The system was used for exactly these purposes, and the injustices it produced were real and sometimes severe. But it was also genuinely used as an intelligence gathering tool, and many denunciations were accurate reports of real suspicious activity. The Council of 10 evaluated each one, cross-referencing with other sources, investigating before acting, requiring corroboration before arrest. Women used the Bocce di Leone. This is documented. Women submitted anonymous denunciations about neighbors, about landlords, about men who had wronged them, about foreigners whose behavior struck them as suspicious. The same mechanism that could be used against them could also be used by them as a form of power in a city where women had few formal avenues for influencing events. A woman who knew something damaging about a powerful man could deposit that information in a lion's mouth and set in motion a process that might, in the end, serve her purposes. The system, in other words, gave women a way to participate in the intelligence life of the city that was available to them precisely because it was anonymous, because it did not require them to identify themselves or to take on the visibility and risk that formal involvement would have entailed. Part 7: Carnival and the Mask. Venice was a city of masks in both the literal and the metaphorical sense. The Venetian Carnival was not simply a festival, it was a social institution with specific political and intelligence implications that the government was very aware of and, to a significant degree, deliberately cultivated. During the carnival season, which, at its most expansive, extended from the day after Christmas until the beginning of Lent, any Venetian citizen could wear the bauta, the traditional carnival mask and cape, and move through the city in complete anonymity. The bauta was designed to make the wearer unrecognizable. The white mask covered the face entirely. The black hood and cape covered the hair and shoulders. Under a bauta, a senator was indistinguishable from a craftsman. A noble lady was indistinguishable from a courtesan. A Venetian citizen was indistinguishable from a foreign visitor. This enforced equality of anonymity had several effects. It allowed people to move through the city and enter spaces normally closed to them. A woman of the noble class, whose movements in ordinary times were carefully controlled and whose presence in certain places would have been immediately noted, could during carnival wear the bauta and go anywhere. It allowed conversations to happen that would not otherwise have been possible. Two people who could not officially acknowledge each other, a nobleman and a woman whose association with him would have damaged his reputation, could talk freely behind their masks in the anonymity of a crowded piazza. And it created opportunities for intelligence work that were unique to this particular urban environment. A woman agent wearing the bauta could attend gatherings, observe conversations, exchange information with contacts, and do all of this without any of the normal social restrictions that governed her movements applying. She was invisible in the crowd. Her presence in any particular place proved nothing about her intentions or associations. The Council of Ten was very aware of the intelligence value of the carnival season. Their own agents moved through the city in masks, attending gatherings they could not officially acknowledge, meeting sources they needed to protect. But the carnival also created security problems. Foreign agents found the season particularly useful, for the same reasons Venetian intelligence did. The response was typically Venetian. Used the same system against the threat it posed. Station agents in carnival crowds to identify and track foreign operatives who were themselves using the anonymity. Use Venetian women who knew the social world of the city and could recognize the tells of someone not quite performing their assumed role correctly. To spot foreign agents hidden in the masked crowd. Part 8: Languages and their value. One of the most consistent characteristics of the women who appear in the historical record as intelligence assets for Venice is their facility with languages. Venice was one of the great crossroads of the early modern world. In any given week, the city might contain significant numbers of Ottoman merchants, Greek refugees, Jewish traders from across the Mediterranean, German merchants, Flemish merchants, Spanish diplomats, French envoys, English travelers, Albanian soldiers, Dalmatian sailors, and representatives of any number of smaller Italian states. Each group had their own language, their own culture, their own habits. Each moved through Venice with varying degrees of capability in Italian, the operational language of trade and diplomacy in the city, and with their own mother tongues that they used when they wanted to speak privately. A woman who moved in the social world where these groups intersected might need to operate in 4 or 5 languages. Venetian Italian as her baseline, Tuscan Italian as the prestige literary language, Greek, spoken by a large and economically significant community in Venice, Turkish or Arabic for clients from the Eastern Mediterranean, German or French or Spanish for visitors from the West. The value of this multilingualism for intelligence purposes is obvious in one direction. A woman who spoke Turkish could report on what Ottoman merchants said to each other when they believed no one else was listening. But the value ran in a subtler direction as well. People speaking their second or third language are constrained in what they can express. They simplify. They avoid topics where they lack vocabulary. They say less than they mean because they cannot find the words. A person speaking their own language, by contrast, is capable of full expression. And a person who believes that the listener does not understand their language is in a state of false security. They may say things they would never say in a language they expect to be understood. A cortigiana onesta who spoke Greek and who was in a room with Greek merchants who believed that no one else present could understand them was in a position to hear things that no official Venetian intelligence channel could access. The Council of Ten was aware of this. The payment records that survive, fragmentary and encoded as they are, show payments to individuals described as having specific linguistic skills. The line between translation and intelligence gathering was, in practice, quite thin. Part 9. The Noble Women. The Cortigiane Oneste were the most visible category of women who contributed to Venetian intelligence. But they were not the only category. The contribution of women from the noble class, less visible, less documented, more deeply embedded in the official social structure, may have been equally significant. Noble women in Renaissance Venice lived highly constrained lives. Their marriages were arranged by fathers and brothers and uncles as part of the complex political economy of noble family alliances. Their access to the outside world was limited. They were expected to move primarily between the family palace, the church, and the households of other noble families. And yet, within these constraints, they occupied positions of considerable intelligence value. The palaces of the Venetian nobility were not simply private residences. They were settings for the continuous social performance of political life. Visits, dinners, ceremonies, negotiations, arguments, reconciliations. All of these happened in the noble household, and the women of those households were present for a great deal of it. A senator's wife was in the room, or the next room, or at the top of the stairs, when her husband received visitors and conducted business that was officially private, but in practice conducted in a setting where any sufficiently attentive person could hear and observe. She managed the household staff, servants, secretaries, household clerks, who were themselves important sources of information about what happened in the palazzo and who could be cultivated as sources if one knew how. She maintained her own network of social relationships with women of other noble families, and these relationships generated a continuous flow of information about the state of Venetian politics that was different from and complementary to the official male information networks. Women talked to each other. They talked about their husbands' careers, their families' financial situations, their anxieties about political alignments. They shared information in the way that people excluded from official channels always share information through the unofficial channels available to them. The wives of Venetian ambassadors occupied a particularly interesting position. They accompanied their husbands to foreign courts, to Constantinople, to Paris, to Madrid. They were present in environments saturated with political intelligence, and they were often better positioned to access certain kinds of information than their husbands were. A diplomat's wife could form friendships with women of the foreign court in ways that a male ambassador could not. She could participate in the domestic social life of the court, the informal gatherings, the walks in the palace gardens, the shared moments of private conversation that were not available to the official male diplomatic corps. What was said in those domestic spaces was sometimes of considerable political significance. Queens and princesses and noble ladies were not kept entirely ignorant of political affairs. Whatever the official ideology of the period said about appropriate female concerns, they had opinions, they had information, they sometimes had significant influence over the men around them. The wife of the Venetian ambassador, who had spent 3 years at the French court, forming genuine friendships with the women who were the childhood companions of the king, might know things about the internal dynamics of the French royal family that her husband's formal diplomatic reporting had entirely missed. Whether they reported this information formally is a question the historical record does not fully answer. But there are hints, in private correspondence, in the accounts of later historians who had access to documents since lost, of women who communicated what they knew to people in Venice who had use for it. Part 10. The Jewish Community. One of the most significant and most consistently overlooked intelligence resource in Venice was the Jewish community, and within that community, the women occupied a specific and particularly interesting position. The Jews of Venice were confined to the ghetto. The word itself is Venetian, derived from the Venetian ghetto, meaning foundry, after the iron foundry that had previously occupied the site, where the ghetto was established in 1516. It was the first ghetto in history. Within the ghetto, Venetian Jews lived under significant legal restrictions. They were required to wear identifying badges. They could not own property outside the ghetto. They faced a range of discriminatory regulations, and yet they were also essential to Venice. Jewish merchants had commercial networks that extended across the Ottoman Empire, across North Africa, across the Eastern Mediterranean into Central Europe. In short, across precisely the regions that mattered most to Venice's commercial and political interests, and through which information of the highest strategic value was constantly flowing. Jewish traders in Constantinople had direct access to the Ottoman court and to information about Ottoman intentions that was extremely difficult for official Venetian diplomats to obtain. Jewish merchants in Cairo had contacts in the spice trade and in the political networks of the Ottoman administration of Egypt. Jewish families in Ragusa had connections to the Balkan interior and to the Habsburg court in Vienna. This network of commercial relationships was also inevitably an information network, and within the Jewish community, women played a central role in maintaining these networks. Jewish women in this period were significantly more integrated into the commercial life of their communities than their Christian counterparts. They managed businesses, maintained correspondence, conducted negotiations. They were literate. The emphasis on religious education in Jewish communities extended to women in ways that had no equivalent in most of Christian society, and they participated in the intellectual life of their communities in ways that were simply not available to most women of similar social class outside the ghetto. The women who ran the businesses, maintained the correspondence networks, and kept the commercial relationships functioning were also inevitably in the middle of the information flows that those relationships generated. How this connected to the formal intelligence apparatus of the Venetian state is complex. But the Council of Ten was aware of the intelligence value of the Jewish commercial networks, and they cultivated relationships within the community that allowed them to access that intelligence. The intermediaries for these relationships were sometimes women, Jewish women whose commercial activities gave them plausible cover for the range of contacts and communications that intelligence work required. Part 11. The Ottoman Connection, one of the most important theaters of Venetian intelligence activity, was the relationship with the Ottoman Empire, the greatest power of the Eastern Mediterranean, and, simultaneously, Venice's most significant trading partner and most dangerous potential military enemy. The relationship was one of the most complex diplomatic balancing acts of the early modern period. Venice needed Ottoman trade. The spice routes, the silk routes, the commercial networks of the Eastern Mediterranean, all of these passed through territory controlled by or commercially dependent on the Ottoman Empire. Venice could not afford to antagonize the Ottomans without risking the commercial foundations of its prosperity. At the same time, the Ottomans were an expansionist military power whose westward pressure was a constant threat to Venetian territorial possessions. Venice had fought multiple wars with the Ottoman Empire and knew from painful experience that the Ottomans could inflict severe military defeats. Navigating this relationship required intelligence, constant, current, high-quality intelligence about Ottoman intentions, Ottoman military preparations, Ottoman factional politics, the disposition of the Sultan and his court toward Venice specifically. Venice maintained a resident ambassador in Constantinople, the Bailo, who was responsible for the formal diplomatic relationship and for the official intelligence reports that came back to Venice. The Bailey produced some of the finest political intelligence writing of the period. But the Bailey had limitations. They were watched closely by the Ottoman authorities. Their communications were subject to interception. Their access to the inner circles of the Ottoman court was bounded by diplomatic protocol. The informal networks were different. The Greek community, substantial in both Venice and Constantinople, provided some of the most important informal channels. Greek merchants and their families moved between the two cities, maintaining commercial and social relationships that spanned the political boundary between the Republic and the Empire. Greek women in Venice with family connections in Constantinople were potentially positioned at a unique intersection. Part of a network that bridged two worlds, the official diplomatic channels could only partially connect. Some of what passed through these networks was commercially valuable. News of trade conditions, commodity prices, the movements of merchant fleets. But some of it was politically valuable. News of military preparations, of court politics, of the relative influence of different factions around the Sultan. The women who carried this information, who were the nodes in the network, the people through whom messages passed, and in whose conversations intelligence was generated, were not spies in the dramatic sense. They were correspondents, merchants, social intermediaries. But the information they handled had strategic significance, and the people in Venice who received and processed it were very aware of that significance. 12. The price of knowledge. We have been talking about the benefits that intelligence work provided to women, the money, the protection, the social advancement. But the costs deserve equal attention because they were real and sometimes devastating. Venice was a surveillance state in both directions. The Council of Ten watched foreign agents and potential domestic threats. But it also watched its own agents, including the informal ones. It knew that an intelligence asset was also a potential security risk. Someone who knew too much about the Republic's methods and could, under the right circumstances, become a threat. The management of this risk was handled with characteristic Venetian pragmatism. Assets who remained useful were protected and maintained. Assets who had outlived their usefulness or who showed signs of attempting to sell their services elsewhere were dealt with, sometimes through quiet legal mechanisms, sometimes through social ostracism, sometimes through more direct means that left no paper trail. The women who operated within this system knew, or quickly learned, the unspoken rules. The most important of these was, do not become too valuable to too many people simultaneously. A cortigiana honesta who was passing information to the Council of Ten while also providing access to foreign agents who were themselves intelligence operatives was in an extremely dangerous position. Caught between multiple intelligence operations, liable to be identified as a double agent or to have her role exposed in ways that made her a liability to one side or the other. There is also the simpler and more quotidian cost, the emotional burden of sustained deception. To be useful as an intelligence asset, a woman had to maintain convincing relationships with people who trusted her while simultaneously treating that trust as an instrument rather than an end in itself. She had to listen attentively to men who believed she was listening out of genuine interest in them, and to remember and report what she heard to people whose purposes were entirely unconnected to those men. This requires a particular kind of internal management, a capacity to hold multiple realities simultaneously, the social reality of the relationship and the intelligence reality of the transaction, without letting either contaminate the other. Some women were clearly better at this than others. Those who managed it successfully appear in the historical record as individuals of unusual steadiness. Women who maintained their equilibrium across decades of complex social navigation without visible breakdown or betrayal. Those who could not manage it disappeared from the record more quickly. Part 13. The Archives and What They Hide. The historical evidence for the role of women in Venetian intelligence is frustrating in a specific way. It is not absent, there is enough to build a compelling picture, but it is systematically incomplete in ways that reflect the nature of the system itself. The Archivio di Stato in Venice contains millions of documents from the period of the Republic, legal records, diplomatic correspondence, commercial contracts, census data, criminal proceedings, the records of the major governing bodies. It is one of the great archival collections in Europe. But the records of the Council of Ten's intelligence activities are not there, or not in any complete form. The Council maintained separate records, many of which were deliberately destroyed at sensitive moments when discovery would have exposed agents or methods. Others were lost in fires and floods. Others were sealed and remain inaccessible. What this means in practice is that the clearest evidence for women's intelligence roles comes from indirect sources, the records of the Inquisition, which sometimes investigated women whose activities had intelligence dimensions, the records of criminal proceedings, which occasionally exposed relationships the participants would have preferred to keep hidden, private correspondence, which sometimes reveals the informal information networks that formal records never acknowledge. And then there is a different kind of evidence, the gaps, the absence of explanation for events that seem to require explanation. The woman who faced serious charges and inexplicably walked free. The courtesan who received payments that cannot be accounted for by her professional activities alone. The merchant's wife who made a journey that has no obvious commercial purpose. The noble lady who, in the record of a diplomatic event, is described as having had a particular conversation with a particular foreign visitor, a conversation that the record notes but does not explain. The gaps are not proof. They cannot be read as direct evidence of intelligence activity, but they are suggestive in ways that historians of Venetian intelligence have increasingly found difficult to ignore. The picture that emerges from this combination of direct evidence and suggestive gaps is of a system more extensive and more integrated than the formal historical record acknowledges. Women were not marginal to Venetian intelligence. They were part of the system, part of how it functioned, part of what made it work as well as it did for as long as it did. Part 14. The Fall of the Republic. The Venetian Republic did not end through conquest in the traditional sense. It ended through a combination of exhaustion, military pressure, political miscalculation, and the irreversible shift in European power dynamics that the Napoleonic Wars represented. On the 12th of May, 1797, the last Doge of Venice, Ludovico Manin, abdicated. He reportedly removed his ducal cap and handed it to his valet, saying, "I will not be needing this again." Napoleon's forces occupied the city. The Libro d'Oro, the golden book of noble families that had defined Venetian political life for centuries, was burned. The institutions of the Republic were dissolved. The fall of the Republic had been a long time coming. The city had been in decline for over a century. The shift of trade routes away from the Mediterranean and toward the Atlantic, following the Portuguese circumnavigation of Africa and the Spanish opening of the Americas, had gradually undermined the commercial foundations that had made Venice great. The Ottoman wars of the 16th and 17th centuries had cost the Republic territorial possessions and enormous treasure. The plague had devastated the population multiple times. The intelligence system had also decayed, not in its methods, which remained sophisticated, but in its relevance. The intelligence that had mattered about Ottoman intentions, about the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, about the movements of the spice trade, was no longer the intelligence that mattered most. Europe's center of gravity had shifted west and north, and Venice's extraordinary expertise in Eastern Mediterranean intelligence was increasingly irrelevant to the new order. When Napoleon's forces arrived, the Council of Ten dissolved quietly and without drama. Its records were partially destroyed, partially seized, partially scattered. The agents who had worked for it, including the women who had served as informal intelligence assets across the centuries of the Republic's existence, disappeared back into private life without acknowledgement. The system ended as it had always operated, without ceremony, without formal recognition, without the kind of public documentation that would have allowed later historians to reconstruct it fully. Part 15. What they left behind. The women who spied for Venice left almost nothing that acknowledged what they had done. They left no memoirs. They filed no intelligence reports under their own names. They received no official recognition. What they left was more diffuse and more durable. Veronica Franco left her poetry, 2 volumes of verse, and a collection of letters that have been read and studied continuously since the publication in the 1570s and 80s. Her literary reputation has been the subject of serious scholarly attention for decades, and it is through this attention that the fuller picture of her life, including its intelligence dimensions, has gradually been assembled. The courtesan honest left their presence in the historical record, in the Venetian census that counted them, in the literary and artistic output that celebrated them, in the legal records that occasionally constrained them, in the diplomatic correspondence that sometimes mentioned them, in the paintings that preserve their faces. The Jewish women of the ghetto left the commercial records of the families they helped manage, the letters and accounts and contracts that reveal, for those who read them carefully, the intelligence flows that moved alongside the commercial ones. The noble women left the evidence of their husbands' careers, their families' political trajectories, the social world documented in private correspondence that occasionally surfaces in archives. What all of these fragments add up to is not a complete picture. It never will be. The nature of intelligence work is that it generates records only in failure. When something goes wrong, when someone is caught, when an investigation is launched, success leaves no record. The information that was passed and assessed and acted on and forgotten, the thousand small transactions that constituted the daily intelligence life of the Republic, is simply gone. What remains is enough to know that it happened, enough to know that women were part of it, enough to know that the most sophisticated intelligence system in the early modern world was built, in significant part, on the access and the skills and the particular social position of women who moved through spaces and heard conversations that the official male apparatus of the state could not reach. This is not a heroic story exactly. It is not a story of women breaking free from oppression to serve a higher cause. Most of these women were pragmatic actors in a complex world, making the best calculations they could about their own interests. The system they served was not always just or kind to them, but they were there, they were effective. And the city that survived for nearly 1,000 years as an independent state, outwitting larger and more powerful enemies, maintaining its commercial empire, navigating the treacherous politics of the early modern Mediterranean, did so in part because it was willing to look beyond the obvious sources of intelligence and to find value in places and people that its rivals overlooked. Part 16. The Seasons of the System. Venice changed with the seasons in ways that mattered to the intelligence system. Summer brought the heat and the smell. The canals in August were not pleasant, and the plague that periodically devastated the city's population was worse in the warm months. The wealthy fled to the terra firma, to their villas on the mainland. The diplomatic community thinned. The social calendar contracted. But summer also brought the trading fleets, the great merchant convoys that had made Venice rich, the mood that sailed for Alexandria and Constantinople and Beirut on fixed schedules, bringing back the spices and silks and other luxury goods that were the Republic's commercial lifeblood. The captains and officers of these fleets, when they returned after months at sea, brought news from across the Mediterranean world that was nowhere else available. The women who had relationships with these men, wives who had waited through the dangerous months of the voyage, courtesans who had patrons among the merchant captains, were among the first to hear this news. And news from the eastern Mediterranean in the 16th century was exactly the kind of intelligence the Council of Ten valued most. Autumn brought the reopening of the diplomatic season. Ambassadors who had retreated to cooler places during the summer returned to their posts. The Senate resumed its full activity. The social calendar filled again. For the intelligence network, autumn was the season of reconnection. Relationships dormant through the summer resumed their normal patterns. Winter was cold and damp and often foggy. The aqua alta, the high water that periodically flooded the lowest lying parts of the city, was a winter phenomenon, and the fog that settled on the lagoon in the coldest months created an atmosphere of isolation and enclosure. The carnival season, with its masks and its enforced anonymity, was a winter and early spring event. Spring brought the reopening of the sea roads. The galley fleets, laid up over winter, began to prepare for the sailing season. The city was full of the activity of departure and preparation. For the women who served the intelligence system, spring was a season of particular activity. The men who were about to depart on important voyages, who would be gone for months, who might not return, talked more freely in the weeks before departure than at other times. The loosening of inhibitions that proximity to significant risk tends to produce, the desire to be known and understood before going away. All of this created conditions in which people said things they might not otherwise have said. And the women who moved in the social world, where these men spent their last evenings in Venice, were listening. Part 17. The Mathematics of Trust. Trust in an intelligence system has a specific mathematical property. It is much easier to destroy than to build. Building trust requires time, consistency, and the accumulation of demonstrated reliability over many interactions. It requires a track record, the repeated experience of having trusted someone and having that trust vindicated. Destroying trust requires only a single instance of betrayal. One revealed secret, one demonstrated disloyalty, one moment when the person who was trusted turned out to have been using that trust for other purposes. And the trust is gone and not easily rebuilt. This asymmetry had specific implications for the women who were part of the Venetian intelligence system. The courtisan honest, who were most valuable as intelligence assets, were the ones who had built genuine reputations for discretion over years of professional life. Men came to them and spoke freely because experience had confirmed their own experience and the experiences of others they knew that what was said in these women's houses stayed there. This discretion was not a sacrifice of intelligence value. It was the source of it. A woman who leaked what she heard, who repeated gossip carelessly, who sold information to multiple buyers, who let it be known that she had access to important people's private conversations, would quickly find that important people stopped having private conversations with her. The discretion was the condition of the access. The intelligence relationship with the Council of Ten had to be managed so carefully that it never became visible to the very people whose trust was the basis of the system. The men who spoke freely in her presence had to continue believing that the trust was justified. In a technical sense, she was betraying that trust. She was passing along what she heard to people who had not been invited into the conversation. But she was doing so in ways that were invisible and that never disrupted the social reality of the relationship. The senator who came on Tuesday and spoke freely about his concerns about a particular foreign policy question would return on Friday and find to his experience that the conversation had indeed stayed between them. He would have no way of knowing that between Tuesday and Friday, the substance of his concerns had been assessed by people who would use it to shape the response he received when he raised those concerns in official channels. The mathematics of trust in this system required extraordinary delicacy. The trust had to be real enough to produce the access. The breach of trust had to be invisible enough not to destroy the access. And the intelligence produced had to be used in ways that did not reveal its source. This last requirement imposed significant constraints on how the intelligence could be used. Information that arrived through informal channels could not simply be acted upon directly. The action would reveal that the information existed, and the existence of the information would point back toward its source. The Council of Ten was practiced at using intelligence in indirect ways, at allowing it to inform decisions without those decisions explicitly referencing the intelligence that shaped them, at creating conditions in which events unfolded in the desired direction without anyone being able to say with certainty why. This was statecraft at its most sophisticated, and it depended at every step on the invisible work of women who maintained trust that they were, in the most precise sense, betraying. Part 18: Music as Cover and Currency. Music was not incidental to the world of the courtigiani honest. It was central both as professional equipment and as social currency. The ability to perform music, to play the lute or the harpsichord, to sing with technical skill and emotional expressiveness was among the most valued accomplishments in the social world of Renaissance Venice. It was valued aesthetically as art. It was valued socially as entertainment. And it was valued strategically as a means of creating the kind of intimate, relaxed atmosphere in which people talked. A woman who played music well brought people together in a particular kind of shared experience, one that involved genuine pleasure and genuine attention, but that also lowered the social guard that people maintained in formal or explicitly political settings. The man who arrived at a gathering tense with the anxieties of his diplomatic mission might, over the course of an evening of good music and good wine, gradually release some of the tension and speak more freely than he had intended. This was understood. It was part of why the gatherings at the houses of prominent courtigians were so valued by the powerful men who attended them. They offered a respite from the constant performance that official life required, a space where, for a few hours, it was possible to simply be present in the music and the conversation without everything carrying the weight of consequence. Of course, that was not entirely true. Everything still carried consequence. The woman with the lute was still listening. The person in the corner, who seemed absorbed in the music, was still noting who said what. The pleasant evening was still, at some level, an intelligence opportunity. But the performance of relaxation was sincere enough to be effective. The most skilled of the courtigian honest were not pretending to enjoy the music or the conversation. They did enjoy it. The pleasure was real, and it was this quality, the genuine pleasure, the genuine engagement, that made the social environment they created so effective as an intelligence setting. You cannot fake the quality of attention that makes a person feel genuinely listened to and understood. Not for long, and not with the most perceptive of audiences. The men who visited the best courtisan were not, in general, unsophisticated. They would have detected a performance of interest that was not backed by the real thing. The women who were most effective in this world were, in a precise sense, people who genuinely found the conversations interesting, who were genuinely curious about the men they entertained, who brought to the gathering not just the technical skills of hostessing, but an actual intelligence and an actual engagement with the ideas and information that moved through the room. And this genuine curiosity, this genuine intelligence, was itself part of what made them valuable to the system they were serving. Part 19. The Gondola in the Dark. One more piece of the physical world of Venetian intelligence deserves attention. The gondola. The gondola is one of the most recognizable images in the world. The black hull, the asymmetrical design, the standing oarsman, the felze, the small covered cabin in the middle of the boat that could be enclosed for privacy. The covered felze of a gondola provided a private space in a city with almost no private spaces. Two people in an enclosed gondola on a canal were effectively in a soundproofed room. The water around them muffled sound. The enclosure prevented observation from the sides. The darkness of the canal at night made the gondola itself difficult to identify. A conversation in a covered gondola at night was about as private as any conversation could be in 16th century Venice. The Council of Ten used gondolas for exactly this reason, for meetings that needed to happen without any fixed location that could be watched, and without any physical space that could be searched afterward for evidence of the meeting. Women used gondolas too. Their ability to move around the city in covered gondolas was a form of mobility not otherwise available to them. A noble woman who could not appear in a public square or a merchant's office without comment could travel in her gondola anywhere in the city without being observed. This mobility, the ability to be somewhere and then to be gone, leaving no evidence of having been there, had obvious intelligence value. A woman who needed to meet a contact, receive information, pass along a message, could do all of this from a gondola in motion, in the dark, in the rain, when no one would notice or remember. The city itself, its waterways, its night, its darkness, was part of the infrastructure of the intelligence system, and the women who moved through it were part of the city in a way that its official systems never fully captured. Part 20. The Long Game. One of the most distinctive features of Venetian intelligence, compared to the practices of other states of the period, was its orientation toward the long game. Most states in the 15th and 16th centuries thought about intelligence primarily in terms of immediate crises. What are the Ottomans planning for this summer? What is the French king's intention with respect to Milan? Intelligence was reactive, a response to a specific threat or question rather than systematic. Venice thought differently. The accumulation of knowledge about foreign rulers, courts and countries across decades. The library of ambassadorial relazioni, the maintained relationships with long-standing informers, the institutional memory that allowed each new generation of diplomats to build on the work of the predecessors, reflected an understanding that intelligence was a long-term strategic asset. This long-term orientation had specific implications for the women who were part of the system. The most valuable female intelligence assets were not those who produced a single spectacular piece of information and then faded from the record. They were the women who maintained consistent, long-term access to useful people and conversations, who built relationships that deepened over years and decades, who became genuinely trusted by the people they were observing. Trusted in the specific sense that those people spoke freely in their presence. A cortigiana onesta who maintained a productive relationship with a prominent senator or a significant foreign visitor over years was more valuable to the Council of Ten than one who had a single interesting encounter and was never seen again. The former had built something, a sustained access, a developed understanding of a person's character and priorities and vulnerabilities, a channel through which current information could be continuously obtained. This long-term value was recognized in how the best positioned women were treated. They were protected. Their situations were stabilized. Interventions on their behalf, the kind that kept a legal problem from becoming a catastrophe, or that ensured a favorable outcome in a dispute, were made with the implicit understanding that these women were assets whose continued productive functioning was worth maintaining. This is, in essence, asset management, the same logic that modern intelligence agencies apply to long-term human sources. Protect them, maintain their cover, ensure that nothing disrupts their ability to continue producing, was applied in a much less formal way to the informal female intelligence assets of the Venetian Republic. Part 21. The world they inhabited, the social world of Venice in the period we have been describing, was organized around institutions and practices different enough from modern arrangements to require some additional explanation. The Venetian noble class was a closed caste by the 16th century. Entry through wealth alone was not possible, though during periods of fiscal crisis the Republic occasionally sold entry at very high prices. The ordinary path to noble status was birth, and birth into a noble family was both the foundation of one's social position and a set of lifelong obligations. For men of the noble class, these obligations were primarily political. Service to the Republic, in the Senate, in the councils, in the ambassadorial corps, in the naval and military commands, was expected as a matter of class obligation. For women of the noble class, the situation was more constrained. They did not govern. They managed households, maintained social relationships, produced and raised children. The one significant institutional role available to noble women who were not married was the convent, and a substantial fraction of the noble female population occupied that role. The convents of Venice were not the enclosed institutions of strict observance that the Counter-Reformation reformers wanted them to be. Venetian noble families resisted the enclosure of their female relatives with considerable determination because the convents served social functions as places where families could maintain contact with women who would otherwise be entirely separated from family life. That enclosure would have undermined. As a result, the convents of Venice remained relatively permeable institutions throughout the 16th century. Visitors came and went. The women inside received guests in the parlatory, the visiting rooms. Some convents were known as gathering places for musical performances and literary discussions that attracted the same class of Venetian noble that attended the gatherings at the more prominent courtiers' houses. The women in the convents were educated, the daughters of noble families, literate and often genuinely intellectual. They had contact through the visiting networks with a wide range of people and conversations. And they had the peculiar freedom that marginality sometimes confers. A woman who was officially outside the world, in a religious institution, theoretically withdrawn from secular concerns, could sometimes observe and report on that world with a freedom that women more fully embedded in it could not afford. The merchant class occupied a different position. Commercially successful but excluded from the highest political offices, the merchant families had their own institutions, their own social world, their own networks. The women of these families were often more commercially active than the noble counterparts, managing businesses, maintaining commercial correspondence, making decisions in the absence of their husbands. Part 22. The City of Reflections. There is a specific quality of light in Venice that you do not find anywhere else. It is a light shaped by the presence of water on all sides. The reflected and re-reflected light that bounces off the canal surfaces and illuminates the undersides of bridges with a shifting, rippling luminescence that is the material form of the city's characteristic instability. Nothing in Venice is entirely fixed. Even the light moves. The painters of Venice, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Bellini, were obsessed with this light. Their canvases are saturated with it. The golden warmth of the Venetian afternoon, the blue cool of the Venetian morning, the specific quality of illumination that Venice alone produces. For the women we have been describing, this light was simply the light of home, the light of a city they had grown up in, that they knew in all its variations, that they moved through without thinking much about how it looked to people who had not grown up there. But it is worth pausing on because the light is also a metaphor for something about the city's relationship to truth. Venice was a city where nothing was ever entirely clear. The reflections on the water created a visual world of multiple images, shifting patterns, things that appeared to be where they were not. The same quality that made Venetian light beautiful also made it, in a sense, deceptive. The city of reflections, where the image and the thing reflected were always slightly at odds. This seems right for a city whose greatest intelligence achievement was the cultivation of a network of observers who moved through the world appearing to be something other than what they were. Women who appeared to be entertainers but were also observers. Women who appeared to be merchants but were also conduits for political intelligence. Women who appeared to be socialites but were, in the most precise sense, analysts. They were reflections in the Venetian sense, things that showed you something real while being themselves not quite what they appeared. And in the constantly shifting light of the canal water, in the city that was itself a masterpiece of beautiful and productive ambiguity, they did their work and were not seen. Part 23, A Final Night. Let us go back to Venice one last time. A night in the 16th century. The canal is quiet. Somewhere a gondola moves through the dark water, the oarsman's stroke barely audible, the ripples spreading silently outward from the hull. In a room above the water, a window is lit. Inside there is music, a lute, played well. There are voices, laughter, low conversation, the sound of a meal being concluded. The men around the table are powerful men, a senator, a foreign merchant, a visiting diplomat from a court that Venice needs to understand. They have eaten well and drunk carefully, and now they are relaxed in the way that powerful men sometimes relax when they are in a setting that feels safe. The woman who plays the lute is listening. She's listening to the conversation more carefully than to the music, though her hands continue to move on the strings without interruption, without any visible sign of the attention she is paying. She has learned to do this over years of practice, to maintain the performance while conducting the separate work of observation, to be two things at once in a way that looks from outside like only one. The diplomat is talking about something he should not be talking about. He believes himself to be in a private space, among friends, away from the official world where every word is measured. He believes that the woman with the lute is an ornament, a beautiful feature of the room, not a participant in the world he inhabits. He is wrong about this. He will never know he was wrong. The information he provides tonight will make its way through channels so indirect they could never be traced back to this room, to people who will use it to make decisions that will never be connected to this evening's conversation. He will return to his country. He will conduct the business he came to Venice to conduct. He will not know why certain negotiations went unexpectedly smoothly, why certain Venetian counterparts seemed already to know things he had not officially communicated, why the Republic seemed, in general, better prepared than he had expected. The lute plays on. The candle burns low. The canal outside moves in its patient, eternal way, carrying the reflections of 1,000 lights on its dark surface. And in the room, a woman listens and remembers, and the Republic continues to be more than it appears. Finale, water and memory. The city is quiet now. It is always quietest just before dawn, that hour when the night has used itself up and the day has not yet committed to arriving. The tourists have gone back to their hotels. The bars have closed. The last gondolas are tied up along the moorings, rocking gently in the dark water. In this stillness, the city shows what it is beneath everything else it has been: a collection of stones and water and air and light, ancient and patient and entirely indifferent to the human dramas that have been enacted upon it. The Doge's palace stands where it has stood for centuries. The Bosche di Leone are still in their walls, their mouths open, silent now, receiving nothing. The Grand Canal moves in its slow tidal rhythm. The bells of San Marco are quiet. Somewhere in the city, in the Archivio di Stato, in the library of the Museo Correr, in the private collections of families that have been in Venice since the 16th century, there are documents that speak, in their fragmentary and coded way, of the system we have been describing, of the payments and the protections and the informal arrangements, of the information that flowed through channels that have no official name, of the women at the nodes of those channels, passing along what they knew. Most of what they knew is gone. Most of what they heard, most of what they reported, most of what they made possible, dissolved into the decisions and actions and outcomes of 5 centuries of history, untraceable now to its original sources. But the city is still here. And on mornings like this, in the silence before the world remembers itself, you can almost feel the weight of all the invisible things that made it survive. All the quiet work, all the patient listening, all the careful, dangerous, unrewarded labor of people who moved through the margins of power and served the Republic in ways the Republic could never officially acknowledge. The water moves. The sky begins very slowly to think about light. They were there, in the rooms where the conversations happened, in the networks through which information moved, in the invisible fabric that held the Republic together. They were there, and the city is still here, which is, in its way, the most eloquent testimony to their presence. Extended history, deeper into the world of Venetian intelligence. What follows is a deeper examination of the specific settings, the specific practices, and the specific social dynamics that made the Venetian intelligence system function as it did. The more we look at this world, the more clearly we see the women within it, not as dramatic exceptions to a male story, but as structural participants in a system that required exactly what they had to offer. The palace and their inner life. The palaces that line the Grand Canal are among the most recognizable buildings in the world. Their facades, the Gothic tracery, the Byzantine ornament, the classical columns, the great windows that open toward the water, have been painted and photographed and reproduced for centuries. But the facade is not the palace. The interior of a Venetian palazzo in the 16th century was a social world of extraordinary complexity, and it was in that interior world, not in the public face of the facade, that the intelligence life of the city was conducted. The great room on the Piano Nobile, the noble floor, the first floor above the ground, was the primary reception space. This was where the formal social life of the family was conducted. The dinners, The receptions, the visits of state, the gatherings of the political and commercial elite. The room was large, well furnished, and visible, the space where the family presented itself to the world. But behind the piano, nobile, and above it, were the spaces where actual life happened. The private apartments, the studioli, the back rooms where informal conversations took place, and where the business of the house was actually conducted. These were smaller, less formal, more intimate, and in their intimacy, more revealing. The women of the household moved through all of these spaces. They were present in the great reception rooms when the family entertained. They moved through the private apartments as a matter of daily life. They supervised the kitchens and the servants' quarters and the household business that took place below the piano nobile. This range of access was not understood by the men of the household as an intelligence resource. The women were simply there as household managers, as family members, as social performers at the public events. Their presence in the back rooms when conversations happened was unremarkable because their presence everywhere in the house was unremarkable. But a woman who moved through all these spaces, who was present in the reception room and the private apartment and the kitchen and the servants' hall, had a view of the household's life that no one else possessed. She knew, in a way that no single male visitor could know, the texture of the household's real situation, its financial state, its political anxieties, its internal conflicts, the gap between what the family presented to the world and what was actually happening. This knowledge was enormously useful to anyone who needed to understand the Venetian political class from the inside. A council of 10 that had accurate assessments of which noble families were financially secure and which were desperate, which senators were genuinely committed to the stated positions, and which were under pressure from private interests, which political alliances were solid, and which were about to break. Such a council was far better positioned to make effective decisions than one that had to rely entirely on the public performance of political life. And the women who could provide that assessment were the women who lived in those households, or who had access to them through the intimate social connections that structured the lives of Venetian women of the noble and merchant classes. The social call that a noble woman made to the wife of a senator was not, on its surface, intelligence work. It was courtesy. It was the maintenance of the social relationships that held Venetian society together. But within the social call, if the visitor was attentive and the hostess was relaxed, and the conversation went in the right direction, information of real political significance could change hands. Not state secrets, not the deliberations of the Senate, but the human intelligence that gave those deliberations the context, the personalities, the anxieties, the pressures, the relationships that shaped how official decisions were made and how they would be implemented. This kind of social intelligence was the raw material from which more refined political assessments were made. It was gathered in drawing rooms and at dinner tables and in the corridors between the public and private spaces of the palace. And it was gathered disproportionately by women. The Rialto district, the commercial heart of Venice, was not a single space, but a network of interconnected spaces, each with its own function and its own social character. The Rialto Bridge itself was a gathering place as much as a functional crossing. People stopped on the bridge to talk, to watch the traffic on the Grand Canal below, to observe who was going where. The bridge was a natural checkpoint, a place where the movement of the city was visible. A woman who spent time on the bridge had, in effect, a view of the city's circulation, could see who was moving between the commercial district and the political district, who was meeting whom, which groups of men were in conversation. The market of the herberia, the vegetable and fruit market on the Rialto, was one of the most important gathering places in the city. It opened early, before dawn in the summer months, and drew vendors and buyers from across the city. The conversations that happened in the herberia were the conversations of the whole city, not of any single social class, but of everyone who needed to eat. For the women who shopped there, the herberia was a place of social intersection where information from widely different parts of the city's social world was accessible. The banks and insurance offices clustered around the Rialto were places where commercial intelligence of the highest value was generated and exchanged. The prices set at the Rialto commodity markets reflected the collective assessment of what was happening across the Mediterranean world. The insurance rates charged for specific voyages reflected the perceived risk of specific routes at specific times, and perceived risk was always partly a function of political and military intelligence. The women who were connected to the commercial activities of the Rialto district as wives or daughters or widows of merchants and financiers, as proprietors of small businesses, as the servants who ran errands between the commercial offices, were embedded in this information-dense environment. They were not, in most cases, explicitly processing commercial intelligence, but they were absorbing it, and it shaped their understanding of the world's condition in ways that could, under the right circumstances, be of value to anyone who needed to know what the commercial community's assessment of the situation was. Modern economists talk about the Rialto as one of the earliest examples of a sophisticated market for information, a place where the price of a commodity reflected not just its current availability, but the collective assessment of thousands of informed participants about what was likely to happen next. The women embedded in this information market were, in their way, participants in one of the most sophisticated information processing systems that the early modern world had produced. One of the most important practical skills for anyone operating in an informal intelligence capacity in the 16th century was the ability to remember. There were no recording devices. Written notes were dangerous. They could be found, read, used as evidence. Coded writing helped, but coding and decoding took time and required materials that were themselves potentially incriminating. The safest form of intelligence storage was human memory, information held in the mind of the agent, accessible only to her, undetectable by any means available to the period. The art of memory, the ars memorativa, was a well-developed discipline in the Renaissance, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman techniques for memorizing large amounts of information systematically. The technique most commonly described involves constructing a mental building, the memory palace, and placing pieces of information in specific locations within it, using vivid mental images to make each piece of information retrievable. Whether the women who served as intelligence assets in Venice were explicitly trained in these techniques is not documented, but the capacity for precise recall that the work required, remembering exactly who said what to whom in what order during a long social evening, would have been recognized as a specific skill worth developing, and the techniques for developing it were available and discussed in the intellectual world the courtisan honest inhabited. What we do know is that the intelligence coming from informal human sources in Venice was, by general acknowledgement, remarkably accurate. The picture that the Council of Ten assembled of foreign individuals, their personalities, their intentions, their relationships. This picture was detailed and precise, in ways that required more than vague impressions. Someone was paying close attention and remembering accurately. The courtesan honest, in particular, had professional incentives to develop exactly this kind of attention and memory. Understanding a client, really understanding him, in the precise way that allowed her to serve his specific needs and anticipate his specific expectations, required paying the kind of close attention to a person that most social interactions do not invite. It required noticing details that most people overlook, remembering specifics that most people forget, building up over time a detailed picture of an individual that allowed her to interact with him with a precision that felt, from his perspective, like genuine understanding. This skill, developed for professional reasons that had nothing to do with intelligence, was exactly the skill that intelligence work required. The women who had the most fully developed version of it were, not coincidentally, the most valuable intelligence assets. Loyalty is a more complicated concept in intelligence than it appears from outside. The conventional notion is binary, loyal or disloyal, serving one master or betraying him. But the reality of intelligence work, in Venice as elsewhere, was considerably more complex. The women who served as informal intelligence assets for Venice were not, in most cases, operating out of patriotic loyalty to the Republic. Venice was their home, but it was also the power structure that constrained them, regulated them, taxed them, and treated them as instruments rather than citizens. The uncomplicated patriotism that motivates some intelligence workers was, for most of these women, simply not available. What motivated them was a calculation, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, about their own interests and how best to serve them. The arrangements they made with the Council of Ten or its agents were arrangements they entered into because they judged that the benefits outweighed the costs. Protection, money, influence, the sense of being useful and valued, these were real motivations. But this means that their loyalty was, in a precise sense, transactional rather than absolute. It held as long as the transaction remained beneficial. It could be disrupted if the terms changed, if the protection offered proved insufficient, if a better arrangement was offered elsewhere, if the relationship with the council became threatening rather than supportive. This transactional quality was not a weakness in the system from the council's perspective. They understood it clearly and managed accordingly. But it was a permanent source of uncertainty. An agent whose loyalty was transactional was an agent who might, under the right circumstances, transact with someone else. The management of this uncertainty was one of the Council of Ten's most important ongoing challenges. They needed to maintain the relationship at a level that made defection seem irrational, to provide sufficient benefits, sufficient protection, sufficient sense of valued participation, that the cost of breaking the arrangement would always outweigh any potential gains from doing so. In most cases, they succeeded. The successes, being successes, left no record. The failures, being failures, were often covered up. The true history of how often the system actually worked as intended, and how often it was gamed, subverted, or simply failed to produce useful results, is buried in the gaps and silences of the archive. Venice was not the only state in the early modern period that developed sophisticated intelligence systems. The states of Italy were collectively the most advanced political entities in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, and they competed with each other in every domain, including intelligence. Florence, under the Medici, developed intelligence capabilities closely connected to the commercial networks of the Florentine merchant class, including, inevitably, the women of that class who managed the commercial correspondence and maintained the social relationships through which information moved. Milan, under the Visconti and later the Sforza, maintained intelligence networks that extended through the Italian peninsula and into France and the Holy Roman Empire. The Sforza court was a center of Renaissance culture that attracted artists and intellectuals and diplomats from across Europe, and the women of that court were in the middle of the information flows that accompanied this cultural activity. The Papal States had perhaps the most extensive intelligence network in the European world, given the Catholic Church's presence in every country and its ability to use the correspondence and movement of clergy as intelligence infrastructure. Women played roles in this network too, particularly the women of the convents and religious institutions that were nodes in the Church's communication network. In each of these cases, the pattern is the same. Women who were formally excluded from official power found themselves embedded in the informal information networks that ran alongside official structures. And those informal networks had intelligence value that the official structures recognized and, in varying degrees of explicitness, cultivated. Venice was exceptional not in recognizing this, but in the sophistication and consistency with which it institutionalized it. In the degree to which the arrangements between the Council of Ten and its informal female assets were systematic rather than ad hoc, continuous rather than episodic. This systematization is what made the Venetian intelligence apparatus distinctive, and it is what the comparative history helps us see more clearly. Venice was not doing something categorically different from what other Italian and European states were doing. It was doing the same thing, but better, more consistently, and for longer. Reading through the collection of Venetian ambassadorial dispatches preserved in the archives of the Archivio di Stato, reading them not as diplomatic historians do for their account of official policy, but as an intelligence historian does, looking for the sources that produce the assessments and the gaps they did not cover, reveals a pattern. The dispatches are excellent on official matters. The ambassador's account of a diplomatic audience is detailed, precise, and shows the quality of analytical attention that the Venetian diplomatic system consistently produced. But when the dispatches turn to more personal matters, to the private character of foreign rulers, to the internal dynamics of court relationships, to the social reality beneath the official surface, the source of the information is often not identified. The ambassador reports a fact that he could not have observed directly and does not explain how he came to know it. A foreign ruler's health condition, described with a precision that suggests inside knowledge beyond what public observation could provide. A family conflict within the foreign court, reported in terms that imply access to conversations that official diplomatic channels would not have produced. An assessment of a minister's real influence as distinct from his nominal position that could only have come from social intelligence of a kind that formal audiences do not generate. These unattributed pieces of intelligence are, in a sense, the signatures of the informal female networks. They are what those networks produced. Social intelligence that was accurate and valuable, but that had no official attribution because its sources could not be named in official documents. The dispatches record the intelligence without recording the source. The gap between what the ambassador could directly know and what his dispatches report, knowing, is the negative space that the informal female networks occupy. This reading of the dispatches is not the conventional one. The diplomatic historians who have studied these documents have not, for the most part, asked the question of where the unattributed intelligence came from. They have focused on what the dispatches say rather than on what they do not say about their own sources. But asked with the right question, where did the ambassador get this? The dispatches reveal, in the silences, a systematic reliance on sources that the official record was designed not to expose. Those sources were, in significant part, the women we have been discussing throughout this story. The transmission of knowledge across generations is one of the most important and least studied aspects of the female intelligence world we have been describing. The knowledge that made a woman valuable in this system, the social intelligence, the linguistic skills, the capacity for sustained attention, the understanding of how to navigate the world of powerful men without being destroyed by it was not acquired in a single generation. It was accumulated over time, and it was transmitted from women who had it to women who were developing it. In the world of the courtisan honest, this transmission happened primarily from mothers to daughters. A daughter born into the profession began her education early and was guided by a mother or a family of women with experience in the world toward the specific combination of accomplishments and understanding that would make her effective. This was a formal apprenticeship in certain respects. The instruction in music, languages, and literature was deliberate and structured, but it was also something more diffuse and harder to teach explicitly. The understanding of how the world worked, what motivated the men who moved through it, what the risks were, and how to manage them, what the rewards were, and how to obtain them. This understanding was transmitted through conversation, through observation, through the gradual exposure of a younger woman to the situations and challenges that the older woman had learned to navigate. It was the kind of knowledge that could not be written in a book. It could only be lived. The intelligence dimensions of this knowledge transmission are important. A daughter who grew up watching her mother navigate the intelligence relationship with the Council of Ten, who saw over years how that relationship worked, what was expected, how the protections were obtained and maintained, what the risks looked like and how they were managed, was acquiring, without explicit instruction, an understanding of how to operate within this specific system. This created a kind of continuity that was unusual in the intelligence world of the period. Most intelligence relationships were relationships between individuals. When the individual was gone, the relationship was over. But a mother-daughter transmission of intelligence capability created something closer to an institutional continuity, a persistent resource that the Council could draw on over generations. We have come back throughout this story to the problem of silence, to the fact that the most important evidence for what we are describing is not the evidence that exists, but the evidence that does not. The Council of Ten's deliberate destruction of sensitive documents, the informal agreements that were never written down, the payments recorded in terms that concealed their purpose, the identities protected so carefully that they did not survive into any historical record. This silence is not merely frustrating for the historian. It is itself a form of evidence. It tells us something about the system, specifically that the system was designed by people who understood the danger of documentation and who took active steps to prevent the creation of records that could expose their methods and agents. A system that is poorly designed or that operates among people who do not fully grasp the risks leaves abundant documentation. The conspirators who are caught are always those who wrote things down, who kept records, who created the evidentiary trail that investigators need. The fact that the Council of Ten's informal intelligence networks left such sparse documentation is a testament to the sophistication of the people who designed and operated them. They knew what they were doing. They knew that security required silence, and they enforced that silence systematically. For the women who were part of these networks, this meant something specific. They could not be publicly acknowledged. Their contributions could not be recognized. Their names could not appear in documents that praised the service. They existed in the system, but the system could not afford to acknowledge their existence. This was the price of the protection that made the work possible. To be protected, you had to be invisible. To be invisible, you had to be unacknowledged. The two things were inseparable. And so they remain unacknowledged centuries later in most of the histories that tell the story of Venetian power. But they were there. The silence is shaped by their presence. You can feel them in the inexplicable outcomes, the surprising outcomes, the outcomes that make complete sense only when you add to the picture the invisible network of women who moved through the social world of the Republic, listening, remembering, and reporting what they heard. Veronica, Franco's poetry has been mentioned several times in the story, but we have not spent enough time with it. The poetry deserves more attention because it is the most direct surviving evidence of the intelligence of the mind that made her such a valuable social operator. Her terzarim, her capitoli, are love poems in the tradition established by Petrarch, but they are also something more interesting than conventional love poetry. They are psychological documents, attempts through the formal discipline of verse to understand and articulate the inner life of a person, their own inner life, and by extension, the inner lives of the people they loved and by whom they were or were not loved in return. This psychological project, the attempt to understand consciousness from the inside, to articulate what it actually feels like to be a person in a specific situation with specific feelings, requires exactly the kind of attention that makes a good intelligence observer. The capacity to observe carefully, the willingness to see clearly rather than to see what you want to see, the ability to hold complexity and contradiction without resolving it prematurely. Franco wrote poems about desire and its complications with a directness that was unusual in the period. Unusual for any poet, and especially unusual for a woman writing under her own name. She wrote about the experience of waiting and hoping and being disappointed, about the economics of love in a world where love was also commerce, about the specific texture of her own life, its particular pleasures, and its particular costs. This is not intelligence work, it is art. But the same mind that produced this art, the same capacity for attention and memory and the articulation of what has been observed, was the mind that made Veronica Franco so effective in the social world, where intelligence was gathered. The intelligence analyst and the poet are, in this sense, engaged in related projects. Both are trying to understand the human world accurately. Both require the capacity to observe without distortion, to remember what was actually there rather than what would have been more convenient, to articulate what has been observed in terms that make it useful to someone else. The tools are different, the outputs are different, the purposes are different, but the underlying capacity, the quality of attention that makes genuine understanding possible, is the same. There is a particular quality to the weight of Venice, the weight of a city that sits in water, that is supported by millions of wooden piles driven into the lagoon floor, that floats, in a sense, on the combination of its own density and the buoyancy of the shallow sea around it. This is a city that should not exist. By the ordinary logic of geography and geology, it should have sunk, or flooded, or decayed back into the lagoon from which it rose. That it has not, that it is still there, still inhabited, still standing after 15 centuries of water and salt and tide and storm, is one of the more remarkable facts in the history of human civilization. The women who served its intelligence system contributed in their way to this improbable survival, not through dramatic acts of heroism, not through the kind of deed that gets recorded in chronicles and celebrated in monuments, but through the patient, sustained, invisible work of gathering and transmitting information that helped the Republic make better decisions than it otherwise would have made. Better decisions meant fewer catastrophic mistakes. Fewer catastrophic mistakes meant the survival of the commercial empire that made everything else possible. The survival of the commercial empire meant the continuation of the Republic. This is a long causal chain, and it passes through too many variables to trace precisely. But it is not wrong to say that the women we have been describing were, in some sense, part of what held the city up, part of what kept it from sinking back into the lagoon. The water is still there, the city is still there, and somewhere in the deep memory of the place, in the stones and the water and the particular quality of the light, the presence of those invisible women persists, not in any way you can point to, not in any record you can read. Just in the fact of the city's survival, which required more than anyone usually acknowledges, more from more kinds of people, more from more invisible sources than the official history's record. They were there. The city is here. That is the connection. The Venetian Republic lasted from its foundation in the 5th century to its dissolution in 1797. That is approximately 13 centuries, longer than any other republican government in history, longer than most empires, longer than most human institutions of any kind. The intelligence system that was part of what made this survival possible was not static across those centuries. It developed, evolved, adapted to changing circumstances, incorporated new methods and new categories of information. The Council of Ten that existed in the 15th century was not identical in its methods and practices to the Council of Ten that existed in the 17th. The quotidiens honnêtes of the 16th century were not identical in their social position or their intelligence role to the women of any other period. But through all these changes, certain constants persisted. The commitment to gathering information systematically rather than episodically. The understanding that the most valuable intelligence came from human relationships rather than from technical surveillance. The appreciation of the fact that the best intelligence assets were people who had their own reasons to provide information rather than people who were being coerced. And the recognition, implicit rather than explicit, embedded in the practices of the system rather than in any written doctrine, that women who occupied certain social positions had access to information that the formal, male-dominated intelligence apparatus could not reach. This recognition was never codified. It was never turned into a formal policy or a systematic program. It operated at the level of practice, of what individual handlers and council members did when they identified a useful informal source and established an arrangement that worked for both sides. But because it was embedded in practice rather than policy, it survived the various reforms and reorganizations that the Council of Ten went through across the centuries. It was too useful to abandon. too productive to replace with something more formal, and therefore more visible and more vulnerable. So it persisted through the 15th century and the 16th and the 17th, through the Ottoman Wars and the plague and the commercial decline and the long twilight of a republic that had been the most powerful state in the Mediterranean and was gradually becoming something smaller and less consequential. The women who served it persisted too. Not the same women. They lived and aged and died like everyone else, and their places were taken by daughters and younger women who had inherited their social positions and their intelligence value. But the type persisted, the role persisted, the contribution persisted, until in the very last years of the Republic, it no longer mattered. Until Napoleon's armies made the question of intelligence moot, because no amount of information could have stopped what was coming. But it had mattered. For 13 centuries, it had mattered. We have come to the end of this long story about women, intelligence, and the Venetian Republic that ended more than 2 centuries ago. The city is still there. The palaces are still there. The canals are still there. The archives survive in fragments. The paintings survive in museums around the world. And the history survives. Not the complete history, not the true and total account of everything that happened, but enough of it that we can reconstruct with patience and with the right kind of attention, something of what the Republic was, including the invisible parts, including the parts that were never meant to be remembered. The women we have been describing did not want to be known. Their value to the system they served depended on their not being known. They operated in the deliberate obscurity that intelligence work requires, and they maintained that obscurity so effectively that most of them are unknown even now. But we know they were there. The system required them. The outcomes suggest them. The patterns in the record imply them. They are in the gaps, the silences, the spaces between what the official record says and what must have happened to produce the results we can observe. They were there. They served a republic that was, by modern standards, far from just, that excluded them from citizenship, that regulated their lives, that used their contributions without acknowledging them. And they did it anyway, because it served their interests. Because they had made their calculations and decided that the arrangement, imperfect as it was better than the alternatives. This is not heroism in the conventional sense. It is something more human and more interesting. The practical intelligence of people operating in constrained circumstances, finding the leverage available to them, using it as effectively as they can. The republic they served is gone. The water that surrounded it remains. The light on that water remains. The stones remain. And in the stones, in the water, in the light, in the long memory of a city that has forgotten more than most places ever knew, they remain too. Invisible as they always were. Present as they always were. The bells of San Marco will ring soon. The sky over the lagoon will begin very slowly to lighten. The water will catch the first grey hint of dawn and hold it for a moment before the day commits fully to arriving. And somewhere in the city, in some room that has stood for 400 years, in some stones that remember the weight of the footsteps that crossed them in the 16th century, the quiet presence of those invisible women persists, not as ghosts, not as memories, just as the structural fact of their having been there, embedded in the place itself, in the way that all human presence eventually becomes part of the places where it happened. They were there. The Republic survived in part because they were, and the city is still there, floating on its lagoon, carrying its impossible weight of history on its wooden foundations, still beautiful, still strange, still the place that the courtesan honest, and the senators' wives, and the Jewish widows, and the Greek merchants' daughters moved through in the centuries, when the most powerful intelligence system in the world was partly, invisibly, theirs. To understand how intelligence worked in Venice, you need to understand something about the texture of daily life in the city. Not the grand events, the wars and the treaties and the diplomatic crises, but the ordinary rhythm of existence in a place where everyone lived in close proximity to everyone else, and where the boundaries between public and private were negotiated differently than they were anywhere else. Venice was a city of approximately 100,000 people, crowded onto a collection of islands that together covered perhaps 7 square kilometers. There was no room to spread out. There were no private gardens, no long distances between neighbors, no possibility of the kind of physical isolation that allows people in larger spaces to believe themselves unobserved. The streets, the calle, the narrow passages between buildings were so tight that in many places two people could not walk abreast. Sound carried easily across these narrow spaces. A conversation in one apartment could be heard in the apartment above, below, or across the alley. The physical architecture of the city enforced an intimacy that was, for those accustomed to more open spaces, sometimes oppressive. But this enforced intimacy was also the city's intelligence infrastructure. In a place where everyone can hear everyone else, where the servants of one household know the servants of every neighboring household, where the same vendors supply the kitchens of half the buildings on a given street, where children play in the same small campo that the parents walk through before them. In such a place, information moves with extraordinary speed and efficiency. Nothing significant could happen in Venice without the surrounding social network knowing about it. A death in a noble family, a business failure among the merchants, the arrival of an unusual visitor, a midnight altercation in a tavern. All of these would be known throughout the relevant circles within hours. Women were particularly embedded in this information network. The management of a household required constant engagement with the commercial and social fabric of the neighborhood. Shopping for food, supervising servants, managing relationships with the tradespeople who supplied the house. All of these activities required movement through the neighborhood and contact with the network of relationships that constituted its social life. A woman who ran a prosperous household in Venice, whether a noble's wife or a successful courtesan or a merchant's widow, was in daily contact with dozens of people whose own contacts extended through the entire social world of the city. She knew what was happening in the neighborhood. She knew what was happening in the families she interacted with. She knew, often before any official channel did, when something had changed in the circumstances of the people around her. This was not espionage. It was simply the ordinary social intelligence of a person embedded in a complex community. But it was exactly the kind of information that, in aggregate and over time, gave the Venetian state its remarkable awareness of what was happening within its own territory. The transition from this kind of ordinary social intelligence to the more formal intelligence work that we have been discussing was not a sharp line. It was a gradient from the woman who simply knew things and occasionally mentioned them to someone who found them useful, to the woman who was systematically collecting information on behalf of an identifiable principle, to the woman who was conducting defined operations with specific objectives. Most of the women who contributed to Venetian intelligence was somewhere in the middle of this gradient, not entirely passive recipients and transmitters of whatever happened to come their way, but also not running operations in the modern sense, just people who had access to useful information and who had found arrangements through which that information could be made to serve purposes that benefited them. Throughout this story, we have been navigating a tension that deserves more direct attention. The tension between women as agents of their own destiny and women as instruments of someone else's purposes. The women of Venice's intelligence networks were, in a very real sense, exploited. They operated within a system that took from them their access, their social capital, their risk-taking, their labor, while offering in return arrangements that were beneficial but rarely equal. The republic that benefited from their work did not grant them citizenship, did not acknowledge their contributions, did not provide them with the institutional security and recognition that it provided to its male servants. This is the reality of operating in a system of structure inequality. You can be useful within such a system. You can extract benefits from it. You can even, in certain circumstances, accumulate real power within it. But the system itself is not designed for your benefit, and the arrangements it offers you are always conditional on your continued usefulness. And yet, there is something that deserves to be called agency in what they did. The ability to see clearly what your situation actually is, and to make the best possible use of whatever leverage you have within it, is a form of intelligence that goes beyond mere survival. The women who served Venice's intelligence networks were not passive victims of a system they could not understand or resist. They understood it, they worked it, they extracted from it what it had to offer. This is not the same as freedom. It is not the same as equality, but it is not nothing either. It is the kind of power that people develop when the obvious forms of power are not available to them. The power of the observer, the listener, the person who moves through the world so quietly that the people around them do not notice they are being watched. Venice's greatness was built in part on this kind of power, and the women who exercised it, who turned the constraints of their social positions into sources of intelligence value, were a part of what made Venice what it was. The nature of the work. Let us be precise about something that this story has been circling around without fully confronting. What exactly was the work? The word intelligence covers an enormous range of activities, from the sophisticated coordinated operations of a modern spy agency to the simple act of a person paying close attention to a conversation and remembering what was said. The women we have been discussing were engaged in something that falls much closer to the latter end of this spectrum than to the former. They were not, in general, being tasked with specific intelligence requirements, handed a list of questions to answer and sent into the field to answer them. They were not running agents of their own. They were not intercepting communications or breaking codes. What they were doing was simpler and, in its own way, more fundamental. They were being present. They were being observant. They were being in the right places, at the right times, with the right people, which is to say, in the places and times and company that the social positions naturally put them. And they were paying genuine sustained attention to what they saw and heard. And then they were reporting it. The reporting, too, was rarely dramatic. There were no dead drops, no coded signals, no clandestine meetings in dark alleyways. The most common form of reporting was conversation. a woman speaking with someone she trusted, who had a relationship with the formal intelligence apparatus, who would pass along what she had to say to the people who needed to hear it. This was the intelligence cycle at its most stripped down. Observe, remember, tell someone, the simplest possible form of human intelligence gathering. And yet, its products fed into some of the most consequential decisions the Venetian Republic made over the centuries of its existence. The assessment of foreign rulers' characters and intentions, the evaluation of potential threats, the understanding of the political dynamics of courts and commercial centers that Venice needed to navigate. All of this ultimately rested, at some level, on the observations of people who were in the right rooms at the right times and who were paying attention. The cortigiani onesti were not the only people in those rooms, but they were consistently present in them, and they had developed, through the particular demands of their professional lives, exactly the combination of skills: linguistic fluency, social intelligence, trained memory, the ability to maintain a performance while conducting a separate observation that made the work possible. The Council of Ten did not create this, they found it. They recognized its value, and they established the arrangements that allowed them to benefit from it. One more image, one more room, one final night. This time, it is the night before Ash Wednesday, the last night of Carnival. In the morning, the masks will come off and the long austerity of Lent will begin. But tonight is still the Carnival, and Venice is still the city that the Carnival makes it. Fluid, anonymous, permissive, strange. A woman stands at a window overlooking one of the smaller canals. She is wearing the bauta, the white mask, the black hood. She has been wearing it since this afternoon. She has attended 3 separate gatherings, spoken with 6 or 7 men whose identities she knows but who do not know hers, observed a conversation between 2 men who believed themselves unobserved, and carried away in her memory a set of facts that she will spend tomorrow morning organizing into the report she has agreed to provide. She is not thinking about that now. She is looking at the canal. The water moves. Even in still weather, even on a night with no wind, the water of Venice is never entirely still. The tides move through the lagoon continuously, and the canals pulse with them, the water rising and falling in a rhythm so slow that you notice it only if you watch the same spot for a long time. She has been watching this canal her whole life. She knows the way the water moves here, the particular way the reflections distort in this specific section of the canal. It is the most familiar thing in the world to her. Tomorrow the mask comes off and the ordinary life begins again. The ordinary life, which is not ordinary, which is complicated and unpredictable and sometimes dangerous in ways that the simple word ordinary does not begin to capture, but which is, for better and worse, hers. She turns from the window. Behind her, the sounds of the last night of Carnival continue. Music from somewhere, voices, the splash of oars. She has work to do. The Republic continues. What Venice knew. Let us conclude with a concrete attempt to describe what the intelligence system we have been discussing actually knew, and what difference that knowledge made. By the middle of the 16th century, the Council of Ten had built up, over 2 centuries of sustained effort, a comprehensive intelligence picture of the world that Venice had to navigate. This picture covered the major European powers and the Ottoman Empire and the broader Mediterranean world. The picture was not perfect. There were gaps, errors, deliberate deceptions by adversaries who understood that Venice was watching. There were moments when the system failed to catch important developments in time. But by the standards of the period, by comparison with what other states knew about their external environments, the picture was extraordinary. Venice knew, in most cases, when its enemies were planning military action before they struck. It knew when diplomatic initiatives were likely to be productive and when they were not. It knew which foreign rulers could be influenced and through what means, which advisors were most important to the sovereigns, which commercial interests were most sensitive. This knowledge rested on many foundations: the formal diplomatic system, the commercial networks, the agents in foreign courts and cities, the maintained relationships with informers across the Mediterranean world, and it rested, too, on the informal networks that the women of Venice maintained, in the social gatherings of the city, in the commercial correspondence of the merchant families, in the conversations overheard, and the situations observed by women who moved through the social world with the kind of attention that intelligence requires. The formal and the informal were not separate systems. They were two aspects of a single intelligence, ecology, feeding each other, compensating for each other's gaps, producing together a picture of the world that neither could have produced alone. The women who contributed to the informal side of this picture are not named in the accounts of Venice's intelligence successes. The Relazioni do not cite female sources. The Council of Ten's assessments do not acknowledge the social intelligence that the Cortegian provided, but it is there, in the quality of the picture, in the accuracy of the assessments, in the consistency with which Venice navigated a world that should, by all rights, have destroyed it several times over. They contributed to what Venice knew, and what Venice knew is part of why Venice survived. The city is quiet now. It is the hour before the bells ring for the first time, before the vendors open their stalls, before the first gondolas slip their moorings and move into the early light. The water of the Grand Canal is dark and still, and carries on its surface the reflections of the lamps that burn in the windows of the palaces. Reflections that shift and fracture with every ripple and reform themselves in slightly different configurations. The palaces are there, as they have been for 5 centuries. The Bocce di Leone are set into their walls, silent now, their stone mouths open and receiving nothing. The archives hold their documents, their silences, their gaps. The women are gone. The system they served is gone. The republic that needed them and used them and could never acknowledge them is gone. But the city is here, still floating on its impossible foundation of wooden piles driven into the mud of the lagoon, still surrounded by the water that defended it and connected it and gave it the specific quality of light that the painters tried for centuries to capture. And that is still there, still doing exactly what it has always done, turning the ordinary into the luminous, the solid into the shifting, the fixed into the endlessly variable. The city survived. They were part of why. Their names are not on any monument. Their faces are in paintings that are labeled with other names or with no names at all. Their contributions are not acknowledged in any official record. They did their work in the spaces between the recorded events, in the conversations that happened before and after the meetings that made it into the chronicles, in the rooms and the gondolas and the carnival crowds and the domestic spaces where the real fabric of political life was woven. They were invisible. They were essential. The two things were inseparable. And now the sky over the lagoon is beginning very slowly to consider the possibility of dawn. The darkness at the horizon is softening. Not light yet, just the absence of complete dark. just the first suggestion that the night has done its work and is prepared, without drama, to give way. The water catches this not quite light and holds it in the way that water holds everything it receives, briefly, completely, and then lets it go as the next moment arrives. The city breathes. They were there. There is a question that historians sometimes ask about intelligence. Not the operational question of what was gathered and how, but the strategic question of what difference it made. Did the intelligence change anything? Did the information that flowed through Venice's informal networks actually alter the course of events in ways that can be traced? The honest answer is that tracing the impact of intelligence on historical outcomes is nearly impossible. Intelligence works by shaping decisions, and decisions are made in contexts where many factors operate simultaneously. The piece of information that came from a Cortigiana's gathering might have tipped a deliberation in the Senate in a particular direction, but that deliberation was already shaped by a dozen other factors, and the outcome it produced was itself one factor among many in what happened next. What we can say with more confidence is structural rather than specific. Venice's sustained capacity to navigate a world of larger and more powerful adversaries, to make decisions that, on average and over time, served the Republic's survival, required information that was better and more current than what its rivals had. That information came from sources that were, in significant part, informal. And those informal sources were, in significant part, women. The Cortegiana, who heard what a visiting Ottoman diplomat said after his third glass of wine. The senator's wife, who knew which of her husband's allies were genuinely committed and which were waiting to see how the wind was blowing. The Jewish widow, who corresponded with her cousin in Constantinople and understood from the tone of his letters that the commercial situation there was deteriorating in ways that official reports had not yet reflected. The Greek merchant's daughter, who spoke Turkish and understood what the men at the next table in the tavern were actually arguing about, beneath the polite surface of their conversation. Each piece was small. Each piece was uncertain, partial, potentially wrong. But in aggregate and over time and processed by an institutional apparatus that had been doing this for 2 centuries, and had developed the analytical tools to assess and cross-reference and distinguish the reliable from the unreliable. In all of that, the pieces added up to something. They added up to an advantage, not a decisive advantage, not an advantage that overcome all obstacles, not an advantage that prevented every defeat or every loss. Venice lost wars. Venice lost territory. Venice declined. Venice eventually fell. But it survived for 1,000 years in a world that was trying to destroy it. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. And part of the reason it survived was that it knew things. And part of the reason it knew things was that certain women were paying attention. That is the contribution. Measured not in dramatic individual acts, but in the sustained, ordinary, invisible labor of being present and observant in the rooms where things happened, and in the systems that gathered what those women saw and knew and reported, and turned it into the intelligence that helped the Republic endure. The history told in this story draws on real scholarship and real historical evidence, though it is presented in a form intended for listening rather than for academic citation. The Venetian intelligence system has been studied seriously by historians working in the Archivio di Stato in Venice and in other collections of Venetian documents. The relazioni of the ambassadors are real and have been edited and published. The Council of Ten was real, and its existence and general functions are well documented, though its specific intelligence activities are much less clearly preserved. Veronica Franco was real. Her published works, The Terze Rime of 1575 and the Lettere Familiari, a Diversi of 1580, have been studied by literary historians, and her life has been the subject of serious biographical scholarship. The visit of Henri III to Venice in 1574 is historically documented. Franco's subsequent appearance before the Inquisition and her acquittal are documented. The connection between these events and her possible role as an intelligence asset is inference, well-grounded inference, consistent with what the evidence shows, but inference nonetheless. The broader argument that women were systematically important to Venetian intelligence, that the courtisan honest in particular had access and skills that the formal intelligence apparatus valued and cultivated, is supported by the cumulative weight of the evidence rather than by any single smoking gun document. The absence of explicit documentation is, as this story has argued, itself evidence of how carefully the system was designed to protect its sources. The Jewish community of Venice is historically documented. The specific intelligence roles of Jewish women within that community are inferred from what is known about their commercial activities and the intelligence dimensions of those activities, rather than from direct documentation of intelligence work. The noble women, the senators' wives, and the ambassadors' wives appear in the historical record primarily through the documents that relate to their husbands' careers and through occasional surviving private correspondence. The intelligence dimensions of their social activities are inferred from the nature of those activities and from the occasional hints in official documents that suggest information gathering through social channels. The picture that emerges from all of this is consistent and compelling. It is not and cannot be definitively proven. History rarely permits definitive proof of the existence of things that were designed not to leave evidence. But the argument is serious, and the evidence for it is real. Venice today is a city of tourists and restoration projects, and the relentless management of water and decay. The Acqua Alta, the high water, floods the Piazza San Marco several times a year in bad seasons, and the infrastructure of dams and barriers and elevated walkways that the city has built to manage this flooding is among the most ambitious engineering projects in contemporary Italy. The palaces are there. Many of them have been converted to hotels or apartments or institutional uses. The Doge's Palace is a museum. The Bocce di Leone are there. You can still see them in the Doge's Palace, in their original locations. The stone mouths open as they have been for 600 years. The ghetto is there. The Campo is quiet on most days. The synagogues are preserved. There is a small Jewish community still living in Venice, though much diminished from the community that occupied the ghetto in the 16th century. The museum in the ghetto tells the story of the community's history, with care and with an awareness of both what was achieved there and what was suffered. The Grand Canal is there, still the great artery of the city, still crossed by the same bridges. The Rialto, the Accademia, the train station bridge, and now the relatively new Calatrava Bridge that have spanned it at various points. The Vaporetti, the water buses, move up and down it on their regular routes, carrying the commuters and tourists and residents who use the canal as a highway in a city where there are no roads. The archives are there in the Palazzo near the Church of the Frari. Millions of documents, many of them catalogued, but many of them not yet fully studied, waiting for the historians who will spend their careers reading through them, in search of the answers to questions that have not yet been fully asked, including perhaps the questions this story has been asking. The women are not there. They are not in any of these places in any way that can be pointed to, or visited, or examined. They dissolved back into the general past, leaving their traces in the gaps and the silences of a record that was designed not to acknowledge them. But the city is there, and every stone of it carries, in some sense, the weight of everything that happened on it and around it over the course of 15 centuries of human habitation. Every canal holds the reflection of everything that was ever reflected in it, including somewhere in that accumulated weight and those accumulated reflections, the presence of women who moved through the city's social world with a quality of attention that the city needed and that the city used, even as it pretended not to notice they were there. They were there. The city is here. Not all of the women who contributed to Venetian intelligence were courtesans or merchants or diplomats' wives. Some were poets, and the poets remind us of something important about the nature of the work. Gaspara Stampa was born in Padua around 1523 and moved to Venice as a young woman after her father's death. She was not a cortigiana onesta in the formal sense. She came from a family of modest respectability, and her professional identity was as a musician and poet rather than as a companion. But the social world she moved in was the same world. Her poetry, published after her death in 1554, at the age of 31, is among the finest lyric poetry written in Italian in the 16th century. It is poetry of enormous emotional intelligence, focused almost entirely on the experience of love, specifically the experience of loving someone who does not fully return that love. It is valued for exactly the quality of attention to feeling that it displays. What made women like Gaspara Stampa valuable to the social world they moved in, and indirectly to the intelligence world that shadowed it, was not any specific piece of information they might have reported. It was something harder to quantify. It was the ability to understand people. The kind of attention that produces fine love poetry is not entirely different from the kind of attention that produces accurate psychological intelligence. In both cases, the practitioner is trying to understand what is happening inside another person, what they feel, what they want, what they fear, what contradictions they are living with. In both cases, this requires genuine observation and genuine empathy, not just the performance of these things, but the real thing. Women like Gaspara Stampa, whose capacity for this kind of understanding was evident in their art, were exactly the kind of people who, in a social world where intelligence and entertainment were intertwined, would naturally generate the psychological portraits that gave Venetian decision makers their understanding of the individuals they were dealing with. A senator who wanted to know how to approach a particular foreign merchant, what his vulnerabilities were, what he most wanted, what kind of argument would be most persuasive, might not find the answer in the formal diplomatic reports. He might find it in a conversation with a woman who had spent an evening with the merchant and had actually paid attention. This kind of intelligence, psychological, interpersonal, focused on the human being rather than the political position, was among the most valuable that the Venetian system produced. And it was produced disproportionately by women who had developed the skills of attention and understanding that their social position both required of them and gave them time to cultivate. The constraint and the cultivation were two sides of the same coin. The exclusion from official power produced the specific forms of informal power that made the intelligence possible. The world that kept women out of the Senate and the Council of Ten created by the same mechanisms, the social conditions that made women essential to the information flows that the Senate and the Council depended on. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It does not straightforwardly celebrate the women we have been describing, or straightforwardly indict the system that used them. It sits, like the intelligence work itself, in the ambiguous space between the social reality and the strategic reality, between the human truth and the operational truth. The women were there. The system used them. Some of them were willing participants. Some were less willing. Some were caught in situations that offered them no good choices, and they made the best available choice with the resources they had. And the Republic survived for centuries, in part because they were there and doing what they did. That is the story. In the end, that is all of it. The light on the water, the bells in the morning, the silence where the name should be. One thing this story has not fully addressed is the specific relationship between language and silence in the Venetian intelligence world, and this deserves a final brief consideration. Venice was a multilingual city in a way that created specific forms of intelligence vulnerability and intelligence opportunities simultaneously. The vulnerability. In a city where so many languages were spoken, the possibility that any given conversation was being understood by someone who appeared not to understand it was always present. Every language community in Venice was potentially infiltrated by people who were not members of it, but who had learned its language for purposes of intelligence rather than commerce or culture. The opportunity, the same multilingualism that created vulnerability for others, created capability for Venice. The city's investment in linguistic expertise, in the translators and interpreters, and linguistically accomplished courtesans, and socially mobile women who could function fluently across multiple language communities, gave Venice a tool for penetrating the private conversations of every community that passed through it. The women who were part of this linguistic intelligence system were, in a precise sense, bridges. They crossed the boundaries between language communities, between social classes, between the official world and the informal world, between what was said publicly and what was said privately. Bridges are vulnerable structures. They stand in the middle, exposed on both sides. A bridge can be crossed from either direction, and the person who stands on it occupies a position that is, by definition, between rather than within. This was the position of the women we have been describing. They stood between worlds. Their value came from that position. Their vulnerability came from it too. The silence that surrounds them in the historical record is the silence of the bridge, the silence of the space between, where what happens cannot be claimed by either side and so goes unrecorded by both. They were there in that silence, and the city they served, the city that needed them and used them and could not officially acknowledge them, is there still floating in its lagoon, luminous and silent in the hour before dawn, carrying its weight of accumulated history on foundations that have held for 1500 years. Sleep now. The end